Back for another in our series of conversations with 9 News Director of Reporting and our point man on COVID-19 coverage, Chris Vanderveen. And Chris, typically we look at the present and the future of what's going on with the pandemic in our state. Today we're going to take a moment to look back because March 11th was kind of a mile marker when we look at 2020.
Yeah, that was the day I think that I and a lot of people that I know sort of said, holy cow, this is real. I remember vividly watching, it was the Utah Jazz playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, and the game just didn't happen. And then the NBA decided that they were going to cancel all of the games after that. And I think leading up to March 11th last year, we were sort of saying, this is getting progressively worse. The warning signs are there. This is bad. And then something like that happened. And for me, it was one of those turning point moments where I said, okay, this isn't just going to be over in a week or a month. This is going to take some time for us to return to normalcy. I didn't know that even a year later we still wouldn't be there, but it was really one of those sort of big moments in my life.
I think this was the day last year that people who are not necessarily tuned in to what the medical community was doing, I mean, you and I get paid to do that to some extent, but to people who are not following that closely, they were absolutely incredulous that major sporting events were getting shut down. They were talking about shutting down March Madness. All of a sudden, like across the country, cancellations are popping up, and people were wrestling with the belief that this was even possible.
Yeah, and I think if it wasn't the NBA or the sporting events that hit them, it was going to the grocery store. I look back in my pictures that I took, and it was March 14th of last year where I made that inaugural trip to the grocery store only to find all of those aisles empty. And it was sort of another one of those reminders of like, holy cow, this is not normal. Something very different is taking place. We can sort of look back on it now and sort of laugh about it because we knew it would come to an end. But back then, it was scary. It was intimidating. It felt different. It felt sort of like oppressive to go into a grocery store and see all of the emptiness. It was definitely a different time.
And Chris, when we think back a year ago today, that was the time when there were few enough cases that every time there was a case, there was just this immediate swarm of resources to isolate the person and to wipe down an entire building, which we later learned was not necessarily required and that kind of thing. It was a week from today last year when the bosses decided to put the home studio in my basement, because we thought that if somebody at 9 News got COVID, we might have to shut down the building entirely and wouldn't have a broadcast location.
There were so many unknowns back then. I think what's interesting, you bring about the numbers. Last year at this time, there were 27 identified cases of COVID in the entire state. 27. There were 9 in Pitkin County. It was sort of an epicenter of a lot of the cases in Colorado at this time last year. We will now have close to 900 cases identified today alone. So it puts it into perspective of where we were back then and where we are now. I think also a big change, and you've talked a lot about this on Next, is that the testing is clearly ramped up. I was looking, we had roughly 160 tests capable a day in the state lab back a year ago, 160. Now we're capable of running tens of thousands of tests. Things have changed, but really it was all of that unknown. Where is this going to go? How is this going to, which direction is it going to lead into? My own brother, who's an emergency room doctor, was starting to see cases start to come into his ER, and they didn't know how to stay safe. We know a lot more now. That's good. But this has taken us a long time to get to this point.
When we think about things that reshape America, Chris, I think we're in one of those slow-rolling instances now that probably only has comparison in terms of its speed to something like, World War II or Vietnam or the Great Depression. It wasn't one of those moments in time like the loss of JFK or Martin Luther King Jr. or 9/11. But this pandemic, perhaps unlike some of those other life-changing moments in American history, has impacted every aspect of every person's life, their family, their work, their socialization, their health, their finances, everything.
There's no story that you or I have covered that has come anywhere near the ability to impact people's lives in this way. Even a snowstorm that hits the Front Range, the one that we're going to see this weekend, it impacts people's lives, but not like this in any way. We've never seen a story like that, like this. And people now have been acutely touched by this, whether they know somebody who has been sick or whether they know someone who have died. And a lot of people in the state of Colorado know somebody who has died from this. It has changed our lives in immeasurable ways, and we're still beginning to sort of scratch the surface of how much it will change our lives moving forward.
I think back to this time a year ago when we were just starting to say things like, we're in this together. That phrase echoes in my mind so much. I think the more that I've come to understand that it's not true at all. That the burden has not been shared equally. The luck has not been equally distributed from family to family. Circumstances are very different. There are people who have lost the closest folks to them, who have been economically crushed by this, who mentally are in a terrible place, and there are others who are essentially just minorly inconvenienced. It happened to all of us, but we all really weren't in it together.
No, and I worry about how it sort of exposes those sort of pre-existing fissures that already existed in society anyways. And those fissures have become wider. We're talking about populations that have been hit harder. We're talking about groups of people that have escaped really largely untouched and people who haven't. This has been economic. This has been physical. This has been mental. So many aspects of this, and yet you're absolutely right. Some people have felt this incredibly acutely. They know the direct pain of loss. They've seen it themselves, and other people haven't. It's been a minor inconvenience. Maybe they didn't get enough toilet paper at the beginning, and now here they are, and they're generally fine. And I worry about that moving forward as we try to get ourselves out of this. And those existing fissures that are still in place, that are wider now, what does that look like as we try to start to heal? And over the next 6 months, as more and more people get vaccinated, what does that look like? I think there's going to be some problems just associated with that. But I guess we'll have to see how it goes.
We've learned more about science and medicine in the last year than I think most people care to. It was 1 year ago tonight that I asked people to consider epidemiologists and doctors to be like the firefighters of the medical world who are trying to get our attention about an emerging threat.
Yeah.
For folks who are watching this later on TV and not on YouTube, we're going to play a clip of that for folks. I guess when I look back at that, Chris, I don't know that there's any more faith and trust in science and research and medicine than there was a year ago today, despite what all of those people have done to save lives since then.
I worry, Kyle, that there's actually less trust in the system today than there was back then. At least back then, everyone could sort of admit there was a whole host of things that we didn't know. And yes, we could sort of like look at those people and say, oh, but it's just the flu, and sort of look at them and say, absolutely, it's not. We know that it's not the flu. We know it's going to be worse than the flu. And we could sort of cast them aside. Now we have a whole host of people that simply don't want to believe science, that simply don't want to believe what people who have spent their entire lives researching and telling and looking into these things are telling us and warning us about. And there are people that simply are scared to take a vaccination because of things that they heard on the internet. There's been a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation out there. And I worry that it's actually worse now than it was back then. And it was pretty bad back then. If you remember, Kyle, there were like just us two, just you or I talking online or anywhere saying this is going to be bad. We would get accused of all sorts of horrible things, like trying to scare people because we were journalists. And that's what really got me, is that we were just out here to scare people. And I look back on there, no, I think we were trying to be responsible and trying to tell people where this was going. And a lot of people listened. Honestly, a lot of people battened down the hatches. They went and they did what they needed to do to protect themselves and their family. But here we are a year later. And have we learned any more as a society as to what this is doing to us and what truth is? I worry a lot about that because we are now simply still debating truth. And that's pretty gross at a time when 500,000 Americans have died.
Want to try to end on a hopeful note. And another question that's bounced around in my head for the last year is is unity possible, national level, on a state level? Because if the pandemic couldn't do it, you know, you're not fighting other people, you're fighting a virus. One would hope that people could unite against fighting a virus and so forth. Can we be brought together for a common purpose anymore? It seems like the vaccination effort and success there is about as close as we've come.
I hope so. And I do feel, as harsh as I can sound sometimes in talking about a year ago, I do feel optimistic as to where this is going. I think in order for us to see that, though, Kyle, we're going to have to sort of agree on truth. We're going to have to agree on principles of truth, on principles of science, and stop debating the nonsense that exists on social media and on the internet and stuff that's simply not true. We have to agree on what is a starting line of truth. And if we get there, and I think, and we can agree that sort of like some ideologies need to be sort of thrown out and cast out as nonsense. If we can get there, and we move past this idea, and we start to vaccinate people, and people start to see life return to normal, I think we can celebrate that. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened after 1918, after the pandemic that hit in 1918. And I've read a lot about that, and by 1920, 1921, people didn't want to talk about it anymore. They wanted to move on with their lives, and I don't think it's a coincidence that in the 20s, we saw the Roaring 20s. People were ready to move on and to celebrate life. I think we're capable of that, but that's contingent on things continuing to go well. And right now, again, I'm feeling optimistic. I think this is going to work. I think life is largely going to return to normal around April and May, that time frame when vaccines get in the arms of 70% of people, 70% of adults. So I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful, but we still have to get to a point where we can agree on basic truths.
All right, one last thing. This might be kind of interesting. God and management willing, we'll both still be here in a year, and we can look back on March 11th of 2022. And my prediction for that day is that there's going to be a lot of wrestling going on in society as people try to reclaim something of this 2020-2021 year that they wish that they had again. Something for their family, something for the way that their workplace functions. Maybe it is a common purpose around vaccines, but I think that people are going to compartmentalize a lot of the bad and yearn for what was good in it.
There's a lot of good in this. I think at the end of the day, we've learned the importance of family and little moments and little things that we'll never take for granted again. I think that's been a really good positive. We're sort of like all of the sort of like the ridiculousness of the craziness of the world that we live in here in 2021, where everything is so fast and information comes so fast. We've realized that little things make a difference in our lives, little sort of adventures in life. And just sort of, do we need 1,000 people surrounding us to have a good time? No. And I think we're going to look back and sort of yearn for the time a little bit. I mean, there's going to be things we're going to want to forget. But I think the good thing is it's like there's things that we can take out of this that have been really valuable in terms of us learning how to sort of carry on life in the middle of a pandemic.
Chris Vanderveen, thank you. Look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Kyle.